started with a smile. Just a smile. That's all it was. I didn't think anything of it at the time. How could I? I was polite, sure, but not overly friendly. Not the kind of friendly that would make someone think we were friends. But he did. And that's where it all went wrong. His name was Ethan. He was the kind of guy who lingered on the edges of conversations, the kind who always seemed to be watching but never really participating. He was quiet, awkward in a way that made people uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be cruel. So when he sat next to me in the library one day and asked about the book I was reading, I answered. I even laughed at one of his jokes, a dry, offbeat comment that caught me off guard. That was it. That was the moment he latched onto. At first, it was harmless. He'd wave at me in the hallways, sit near me in class, and occasionally send me a message online. I didn't think much of it. He was just there. But then the messages started coming more frequently. He'd comment on my posts within seconds of me uploading them, like he was waiting for me to post something. He'd message me late at night, asking if I was awake, if I wanted to talk. I'd ignore him, but he'd keep going, sending follow-ups like, "Sorry if I'm bothering you," or "I just thought you'd want someone to talk to." It wasn't long before I started feeling it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I'd catch him staring at me during lunch, his eyes fixed on me from across the room. He'd show up places he had no reason to be, like the coffee shop I frequented after school or the park near my house. I told myself it was a coincidence, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew. He was following me. The breaking point came one night when I was studying for finals. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at it, expecting a text from a friend. Instead, it was Ethan. "I saw you today," he wrote. "You looked really pretty in that blue sweater." My stomach dropped. I hadn't worn a blue sweater that day. I hadn't worn one in weeks. The photo he sent next confirmed it. A picture of me, taken from across the street, wearing the sweater he was talking about. It was from last month. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I confronted him. I pulled him aside after class, my hands trembling but my voice steady. "Ethan, you need to stop," I said. "The messages, the pictures, it's too much. You're making me uncomfortable." He blinked at me, his expression blank, like he didn't understand. "But we're friends," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "I thought you liked talking to me." "We're not friends," I said, sharper than I meant to. "And if you don't stop, I'm going to report you." For a moment, he just stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he nodded, slowly, and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. I blocked him on everything, deleted his messages, and tried to put it out of my mind. But a week later, he was gone. He stopped coming to school, and when I asked around, I heard he'd run away from home. No one knew where he was. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. Instead, I felt uneasy, like something was off. For the next few weeks, life seemed to return to normal. The messages had stopped, and Ethan was gone. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was finally free of him. Then, one morning, I walked outside to find my car vandalized. The tires were slashed, and across the hood, in thick black spray paint, was a single word: whore. My stomach churned. I knew who had done it. I had no proof, but I didn't need any. Ethan was gone, missing, but somehow, he was still here. His obsession still infecting my life. I reported it to the police, but without any leads, there was nothing they could do. I was told to be careful. That was all. I started looking over my shoulder more, double-checking my locks, avoiding going out alone. My paranoia returned in full force, but weeks passed without another incident. I let my guard down. I thought it was over. Then the worst happened. It was a Friday night when I got the call. My best friend Anna had been attacked. She had been walking home from a late shift when someone jumped her from behind, a knife slashing across her side before she could even react. By some miracle, a group of people nearby heard her screams and rushed over. tackling the attacker before he could do worse. The police arrested him on the spot. It was Ethan. When I heard his name, my blood ran cold. He had been gone for months, but he never left. Every act of violence, every sick message, I was the reason behind it. He wanted to hurt me, to terrify me, and when I ignored him, he lashed out at the people I loved. Anna survived, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would stay with her forever. And me? I could barely sleep knowing how close I had come to losing her, knowing that Ethan had done all of this for me. He was charged with attempted murder and stalking, among other things. The last I heard, he was awaiting trial. I prayed he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars, far away from me, where he could never hurt anyone again. I hope to God no one else has to experience something like this. But I know that there are sick people like Ethan out there, waiting for an opportunity to make other people's lives a living hell. The first time I noticed something was off, it was the way he looked at me. Not the kind of look you'd expect from a brother-in-law. Warm, familial, maybe a little teasing. No, this was different. It lingered too long, like he was trying to memorize the curve of my jaw or the way my hair fell over my shoulder. I told myself I was imagining it. Paranoia, maybe. Stress. But then the small things started adding up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. It was a Tuesday evening when I first mentioned it to my sister Claire. We were sitting in her kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us. She was chopping vegetables for dinner, her movements quick and efficient, while I leaned against the counter, twisting the stem of my wine glass. "Claire," I started, my voice low, "has Mark seemed off to you lately?" She paused, the knife hovering above a carrot. "Off how?" I hesitated, unsure how to put it into words without sounding crazy. "I don't know. He's just been watching me, like all the time. It's weird." She laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and went back to chopping. "You're imagining things. Mark's just awkward. You know how he is." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But the way he'd been acting wasn't just awkward. It was calculated. The way he'd accidentally brush against me when we passed in the hallway. The way he'd show up at places I frequented, the coffee shop near my apartment, the gym, even the park where I liked to run. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but when I caught him standing outside my building one night, his face half hidden in the shadows, I knew it wasn't. "Claire, I'm serious," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "He's been following me. I saw him outside my place last night." She stopped chopping and turned to face me, her brow furrowed. "Are you sure it was him? It was dark, right? Maybe you—" "It was him," I snapped. "I'm not stupid. I know what I saw." She sighed, setting the knife down and wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Look, I'll talk to him, okay? But you're probably overreacting. Mark's not like that." I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a long sip of wine and bit back the words bubbling up in my throat. She didn't believe me. Of course she didn't. Mark was her husband, the father of her kids. Why would she believe me over him? The weeks that followed were a blur of unease. Mark's behavior didn't escalate, not exactly, but it didn't stop either. He'd call me at odd hours, claiming he needed help with something trivial. A computer issue, a recipe Claire had mentioned. He'd show up at my apartment with excuses that sounded just plausible enough to be innocent. And always, that look in his eyes, like he was waiting for something. I started carrying pepper spray. I stopped running in the park. I double-checked my locks every night. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always there, just out of sight. Then came the night everything changed. I was at Claire's house, helping her put the kids to bed. Mark was supposed to be out with friends, but when I stepped into the hallway, he was there, leaning against the wall like he'd been waiting for me. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mark, I thought you were out." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Change of plans. I wanted to talk to you." I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the pepper spray in my pocket. About what? He pushed off the wall and took a step toward me. You've been avoiding me. I haven't. Don't lie, he said, his voice hardening. I know you've been talking to Claire, telling her things. I swallowed, my mouth dry. I don't know what you're talking about. He took another step, closing the distance between us. Yes, you do. And you need to stop. Because if you don't... He trailed off, his gaze flicking toward the kids' room. My stomach dropped. What are you saying? He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear. I'm saying you don't want to make me angry. Claire's happy. The kids are happy. Don't ruin that. I shoved him away, my hands trembling. Stay away from me. He laughed, a low, chilling sound. Or what? You'll tell Claire? Go ahead. She'll never believe you. My fingers tightened around the pepper spray in my pocket. He took another step, his shadow swallowing the light between us. I didn't think. I just swung my arm up, thumb jamming the nozzle. The spray hit him square in the eyes. He roared, clawing at his face, stumbling back into the wall. A framed photo of Claire and the kids crashed to the floor. You bitch! He snarled, voice raw. Claire's footsteps pounded down the hall. What the hell is going on? Mark lunged before I could answer, fingers hooking toward my throat. I ducked, but his weight slammed me against the doorframe. My ribs screamed as his knee dug into my side. Claire shouted his name, her hands yanking at his shoulders. He shook her off like she was nothing. You're mine, he hissed, spit flecking my cheek. I twisted, driving my knee upward. He grunted, grip loosening just enough for me to wrench free. Claire grabbed a vase from the side table and swung. It glanced off his temple. He staggered, blood streaking his jaw, but his eyes, wild, unhinged, locked onto her. You're ruining this, he spat, lunging at Claire. I tackled him sideways. We hit the floor, grappling, his hands scrabbling for my wrists. Claire screamed for the kids to stay in their room. A neighbor's porch light flared outside the window, then fists pounded the front door. Everything okay in there? Mark froze. For a heartbeat, I saw the calculation in his face. Risk versus rage. He shoved me off, bolting through the back door just as the neighbors spilled inside. The cops came, took statements, nodded. We'll find him, they said, but their voices carried the hollow cadence of routine. Claire sat rigid on the couch, her knuckles white around a mug of cold coffee. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. He wasn't at his brother's cabin, not at his office. His phone went straight to voicemail. The restraining order arrived 2 days later, a flimsy piece of paper that couldn't stop a bullet. Claire sold the house, moved across town, changed the kids' schools. We didn't talk about the way she flinched at sudden noises, or how I still slept with a knife under my pillow. 3 years passed. No sightings, no calls, just silence. Last week, I almost had a heart attack while walking down the street when someone grabbed my shoulders. It was a store employee bringing me something I had forgotten, but the fear I felt was indescribable. Claire thinks I'm paranoid, but she checks her rearview mirror now too. I think we'll be paranoid for the rest of our lives because of him. The heat in Miami clung to me like a second skin, thick and unrelenting as I wandered down Ocean Drive. The neon lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the sidewalk. I was alone, just another faceless tourist in a city that thrived on anonymity. Or so I thought. I first noticed her outside a dimly lit bar. She stood motionless, her silhouette sharp against the flickering sign. Her face was turned toward me, but the shadows hid her features. Something about the way she stood, too still, too deliberate, made the back of my neck prickle. I quickened my pace, weaving through the crowd, but when I glanced back, she was there, closer now, her eyes locked on mine. Her face came into view under a street lamp, and I froze. A burn scar stretched from her left temple down to her jawline, the skin twisted and shiny. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't say a word, just stared, her gaze drilling into me like she was memorizing every detail. I turned away, my heart pounding, and told myself it was nothing. Just a stranger. Just bad timing. But she kept appearing. At the beach, her figure blurred by the salt spray. In the lobby of my hotel, sitting in a corner chair, her scarred face half hidden behind a newspaper. Once, I caught her reflection in a shop window, standing so close I could almost feel her breath on my neck. I spun around, ready to confront her, but she was gone. "You okay, man?" a bartender asked me one night after I'd slammed my drink too fast. I nodded, but my hands were shaking. I didn't know how to explain it. She wasn't doing anything, not really, just watching. The breaking point came on my last night. I was walking back to my hotel, the streets quieter now, the air heavy with the threat of rain. I heard footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate. I didn't need to look to know it was her. My chest tightened, and I broke into a run, my shoes slapping against the pavement. The footsteps matched my pace, faster now, closer. I ducked into an alley, hoping to lose her, but it was a dead end. The walls closed in around me as I turned to face her. She stood at the mouth of the alley, her scarred face illuminated by a flickering bulb. Her smile was wider now, almost gleeful. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and raspy, like she hadn't used it in years. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "What do you want?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a knife, the blade catching the light. My stomach dropped. I scanned the alley for anything, a weapon, an escape route, but there was nothing. Just me, her, and the knife. "Please," I choked out, my voice breaking. "I don't even know you." Her smile faltered for a moment, and she tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Then, without warning, she lunged. I sidestepped, but the blade grazed my arm, hot and sharp. I stumbled, my back hitting the wall again. She raised the knife, her eyes wild, and I braced for the worst. But it never came. A car horn blared from the street, and she froze, her head snapping toward the sound. For a split second, her expression shifted. Fear, maybe, or anger. And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows like she'd never been there at all. I slid to the ground, clutching my bleeding arm, my whole body trembling. The alley was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. I waited for her to come back, for the knife to finish what it started, but she didn't return. I called the police and left Miami the next morning, my arm bandaged and my nerves shot. I never saw her again. I don't know who she was or why she chose me, but I do know this: I'll never set foot in Miami ever again. It started with an Uber ride, just like any other night. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? The driver was polite, quiet, the kind of guy who kept his eyes on the road and didn't ask too many questions. He dropped me off at my house, and I didn't even wait to see his taillights disappear before I unlocked my door and stepped inside. Normal. Routine. Nothing to remember him by, except maybe the faint smell of pine air freshener, and the way his hands gripped the wheel a little too tightly, like he was holding on to something he didn't want to let go of. But then I started seeing the car. It was the same one. A dark sedan, unremarkable except for the dent in the rear bumper. At first I told myself it was nothing. Coincidence. Maybe someone in the neighborhood had a visitor. But it kept showing up, always parked just far enough away to be inconspicuous, close enough to make my skin crawl. I'd see it in the morning when I left for work, and again at night when I came home. Sometimes it was there in the middle of the day, empty, waiting. I tried to shake the feeling, told myself I was being paranoid, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. Then came the day he spoke to me. I was walking to the park, headphones in, trying to clear my head. The sound of an engine idling too close made me look up. There he was, the same driver, rolling down his window with that same too-tight grip on the wheel. His smile was thin, like it didn't belong on his face. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, like we were old friends. "Need a ride?" I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my voice steady. "No thanks." He didn't drive away. "You sure? It's no trouble." "I'm sure." I took a step back, my hand tightening around my phone. "Leave me alone." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, almost like he was amused, and drove off. I stood there, my legs trembling, until his car turned the corner and disappeared. But he didn't stop coming back. The car kept appearing, always at a distance, always watching. I started taking different routes, leaving at odd times, anything to throw him off. I told myself he'd get bored eventually, that he'd move on to someone else. But every time I thought I'd seen the last of him, there he was, parked under a streetlight or idling at the end of my block. I didn't sleep much during those weeks. Every noise outside my window made me jump. I started carrying pepper spray, checking the locks on my doors 3-4 times a night. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That a man was parking near my house? That he'd offered me a ride once? It wasn't enough, and I knew it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. One day the car was gone. No slow drive-bys, no lingering in the shadows. I waited, tense, expecting him to reappear at any moment. But he didn't. Days turned into weeks, and still nothing. I started to relax, to tell myself it was over. Maybe he'd found someone else to fixate on. Maybe he'd just given up. I never stopped looking over my shoulder, just in case.